If you've been around my channel for a while, you probably know that I like to talk about stat blocks, probably even a bit too much. The reason I find them so interesting is that they function as a direct connection between the person reading them and the creature itself, and by extension, the game. These words on paper or your screen have a direct and immediate and visceral impact on the creature that's being brought to life, and how much work your imagination has to do to truly picture this thing living and moving or attacking and parlaying with the group. It's one of the most tangible connections that the game has, and as a result, I feel as though they have a heavy burden of responsibility to deliver a quality experience for players and dungeon masters alike. The race is very much on to see if I can reach 10,000 subscribers by the time that the new PHB comes out in September. I'll need as much help as I can to get there, so if you like what I do and want to support me, a sub to the channel would be amazing. Shout out to all of my members, but especially those in the Champion tier, Julian, Corel, and Finiki, and the Hero tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear. Click on the join button to see all the perks you can get for becoming a member for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. Now, there are many different schools of thought when it comes to how monster stat blocks should be designed. There's the less is more approach, which leaves a lot more room for interpretation. These types of stat blocks are often very pared down and leave only critical pieces of information that are truly required for running the creature. They will often either assume a lot of prior knowledge, or that the reader will be improvising or using their own logic or intuition to determine how things will work mechanically during the game. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this approach. Many people will prefer this type of stat block, as they feel it allows them to be more in the moment and connected to the creature that they're running, and this is certainly a major plus to this style. The downside is that they can feel overwhelming if you don't have the confidence to run them in an engaging way, or the mechanical chops to run them consistently, which can lead to a varied experience. This approach is absolutely not the one that the Dungeons & Dragons team has taken. They've nearly taken the polar opposite attitude to how they design their stat blocks. I say nearly because some have even gone harder, like MCDM's Flea Mortals, which really has gone all out. The approach that the D&D design team has taken is more about clarity and consistency, and wanting to provide the reader with the ability to run the creature as effectively as possible, while also having needed to memorize or learn as little as possible. They do this by really spelling everything out, probably even things that they don't need to, all in an effort to make the stat blocks easy to use if you've never used one before. The downside here is that they are bulky and long and can sometimes be tricky to find that one specific thing if you're looking for it. They're also repetitive. The upside here is that everything is basically always in the same place. They use the same language every time, they explain in great detail how everything mechanically works, and even specifically tell you a creature's alignment so the reader gets an understanding of how the creature typically interacts with others. I want to be abundantly clear here that neither of these approaches, or anything in the middle for that matter, is objectively right or wrong. This is entirely a matter of personal preference. When it comes to stat blocks, I tend to fall into the more is more camp, at least to a certain degree. There is a point where even I think it's too much. However, a huge part of why I appreciate this approach is for accessibility reasons, which I will touch on later. This idea largely aligns me with the way that the D&D team designs their stat blocks. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the new stat block design that was revealed by Dungeon Dad a few weeks ago that I think kinda got lost a little bit in all the excitement of the class reveals. Let's take a look at the good, the bad, and then we'll revisit the stat block design that I had made a few months ago and see if I can improve it. At a glance, nothing about the new stat block design looks so dramatically different. It will still have a very familiar feel to anyone that's used 5th edition stat blocks. That said though, there have been a number of changes and refinements made to it. The first thing that we see is that the name now lives in its own section and has been separated out from the creature type and alignment, both of which still feature in the block, just now in a slightly different place. This change is neither here nor there to me. It highlights the name of the creature slightly more and provides less of a focus on some smaller details. Speaking of which, that second section contains a lot more information now than it used to. It now combines the creature type, alignment, armor class, hit points, speed, initiative, ability scores, skill bonuses, senses, proficiency bonus, resistances, and immunities all into one section, which has been redesigned to better accommodate everything. When it comes to this section, I've seen a few different opinions about how the layout is structured, so we'll get to that. Firstly, I still like the inclusion of the creature type and alignment, though as I said in the past, I do prefer it to be more of a disposition rather than alignment, but I'm not upset about it. Despite the general lack of relevance that alignment has had in recent editions, and particularly in 5e, I still find it to be a useful tool as a DM if I've never run a creature to get a quick understanding in a word or two about how this given creature might interact with the party or what types of motivations they might have. Yeah, you can totally make this up on the spot as you see fit, but I prefer knowing that there is some typical measure to go by if I don't want to creatively consider every enemy NPC or to run them consistently. The obvious omissions here are that there is no subtype, but not every creature has one, so I guess we just don't know yet. On subtypes, I know this has been something of a contentious debate, at least as contentious as you can get when it comes to stat blocks. To me, I think it's worth having if there are features in the game that make use of it. The old Ranger feature, Favorite Enemy, did, but now that feature has been replaced, so I do wonder if it's just gone for good, but we'll need to see more stat blocks and the full reveal before we have enough details for that. The other omission is the word typically in front of alignment. This has been part of creature design since the Wild Beyond the Witchlight was released. I'd be curious if they're moving back to fixed alignments, but again, we'll just have to wait and see. Some small tweaks that we see are things that used to be spelled out, like armor class and hit points, have now been abbreviated to AC and HP. Additionally, we see that there is a standalone section for initiative and a passive initiative score. This is an interesting inclusion as technically initiative has always been listed on the block, it's just that you had to know that it used dexterity. While this does add additional and potentially unnecessary information, I have to say that I like this inclusion. For one thing, I imagine that at least part of the reason it was added was because new players may have found it unintuitive or just didn't realize that dexterity was used for initiative. This is actually a very common rules oversight, so I wouldn't be surprised if it had a lot to do with their decision to add it. Anyway, I also like it since it is consistent with their design goal of making the stat block very easy to read and understand and find exactly what you're looking for. You don't need to remember or even know that dexterity is for initiative, since initiative is just listed there. This also leaves room for them to include additional information, such as if a creature may now get a bonus to initiative that is beyond just their dexterity, or if they have advantage on the roll. You could argue that they'd only need to include it if there was a bonus, but generally speaking, they like to just always include things, even if they aren't being used. The obvious exceptions to this are things like resistances or vulnerabilities, which aren't listed unless they are relevant. Overall, I like the inclusion of initiative, and I think adding passive initiative on the block can also help certain types of players run quicker games. Next up is probably the most obvious change made, and that's the presentation of the ability scores and modifiers. Now, each ability score is presented in a table that includes the actual ability score, the modifier, and the saving throw bonus. This is another that has caught the attention of many since they feel like it's displaying a lot of unnecessary information that clutters up the stat block. I can see this argument, but let me first say that I do like this layout for the scores, and let me explain why. On the scores themselves, many have suggested that they're almost always meaningless, and this is mostly true, but as it currently stands, there are a few things in the game that are dependent on knowing specific ability scores. Spells like Synaptic Static and Tasha's Hideous Laughter are just two examples. Now again, there's multiple ways that you can look at this. You can say that they should just update those spells to, at the very least, refer to a modifier rather than a score. Or you could change their design entirely, or maybe D&D just abandons ability scores. And while all of these things are possible, the reality is that the abandonment of ability scores would be a massive undertaking that would be more worthwhile in a true edition change rather than what we're seeing now. Or you can just say that as a DM, you have the power to decide that a creature should or shouldn't be affected by something. Again, there's a great argument for that, and it will work wonderfully well for certain groups, but it doesn't lend itself to the type of consistency that D&D is shooting for, and also doesn't preclude you from doing that just because it's written down. Onto the modifiers and the saves, this is probably a bad example of a creature to look at since every number is exactly the same, but I genuinely am a fan of how this is written out. I've heard complaints that there are just too many numbers going on here, and yeah, there are a lot of numbers. There's 18 in a fairly compact table, but they are laid out very clearly and are done so in a way that's very legible as well. I'll be honest, a big part of why I appreciate this design is accessibility. I've spoken on the channel before about how I have a fairly significant visual impairment, and as a result, I tend to zoom in on a lot of things to make them easier to read for me. But more importantly, for those who use screen readers, which I also have in the past, this is actually beautifully written out, since you'll hear each ability followed by its associated scores and modifiers and saving throw bonus in immediate sequence. This is something a lot of people just don't consider because it doesn't affect them, but I guarantee part of the reason this layout was settled on was for accessibility purposes. If you think about the way that saving throws were written before, they'd be in their own section and you'd often be listening for the absence of something, since if say dexterity wasn't listed, you would know that it isn't proficient in dex saves. The thing is though, that as your reader is going through, you then might end up wondering if you just kinda missed it. The way that this table is presented, every score is written out followed by its modifier, followed by its saving throw bonus. Consistency and dependability for those with accessibility needs. This is a huge win in my book. The next big change is that they added a labeled traits section, which is awesome. Before it sort of just launched right into it and there was no clear categorization for what was and wasn't supposed to be there. This isn't anything earth-shattering, it's just a nice improvement to see. One very small change made to the attack section that we see is that it cut the one target from the text. While I had nothing against the added text being there, this does make it marginally clear without sacrificing comprehension. The last major change is to the reaction section, which has had a change to its formatting. Rather than writing out the reaction in the typical natural language way that's often used with everything else, it instead has now been structured as a trigger and response. This is just a nice quality of life improvement as well that makes it a bit easier to parse what's going on with the reaction itself. Sometimes in the past they've been a bit wordy and can be slightly challenging to kind of piece it all together, but now it's incredibly clear at a glance what causes the reaction and what it does in response to that trigger. If it isn't already quite clear, I genuinely do love this stat block. It appeals to the things that I like. It's accessible, it's clear, it uses natural language, which again is a nod toward accessibility, and honestly, it just looks good. I like the shift in colors and the rounded edges. I'm a fan of what they've created here. But that being said, that doesn't mean that I don't think it could be better. In a previous video, I'd shown off a draft of my own version of a monster stat block. It was something of a combination between the standard 5e one and what we saw in MCDM's Flea Mortals, and my own thoughts for what I like to see. So now I've updated that design to coincide with the new version of the D&D block, since there's stuff in there that I also really like. Full disclosure, this is just a draft and not a final design or anything, and it's not perfect because, well, it's still a draft. I'd love any feedback. Last time there was a lot of excitement surrounding the resistances table, so I've kept that in place. I've adopted the new ability score table and the new reaction language and just changed the positioning on a few things to make better use of space while not sacrificing, hopefully at least, accessibility and clarity. So that's the new stat block. I am very excited to see more once we get our hands on the new Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to help me reach that goal of 10K by the time that the new PHB comes out in September, but otherwise, take care.